Hello and welcome to our latest TES Webchat, which we've labelled Why Aren't They Behaving Yet? I'm Ed Dorrell, Features and Comment Editor, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by Tom Bennett, who many of you will know as our TES Behaviour Guru. Hi Tom.
Hi.
For the majority of our readers and users, this week is half term, which for many represents time not just to wind down, but to contemplate the first 8 weeks of the new year, the new class, the new tutor group and the new job. Many teachers, especially NQTs, will be asking, why aren't they behaving yet? Evidence for this, if it were needed, comes in the form of the avalanche of questions we've already received, either on the TES chat hashtag or tschat@tes.co.uk. So without further ado, let's get cracking. But we've got one bit of admin to deal with. All the questions that we'll ask will be anonymous, just in case people are worried about anonymity. So we've got a great question in here to start with. This goes, I am a new teacher and I got off on the wrong foot last half term. Now I feel like my pupils don't respect me at all. How can I turn it round and fast?
That is a very, very common one, especially around about half term for new teachers. I think that any teacher can reboot their classroom expectations, any lesson they want. I think half term is a great way to kind of stick a punctuation mark in the middle of that. If you feel you've got off on the wrong foot with your kids, what you need to do is go back in again, almost like ground zero, and treat it like day one and say, right guys, last half term, the learning wasn't happening. So here are a few things that we need to do in future in order to make sure that it happens in future. And then what you have to do is you have to make your expectations incredibly clear. Because there are two mistakes that new teachers tend to make in the first half term. They're not rigid enough, or they try and be too friendly. And that is perfectly natural for a new teacher. It's something I did as well. But newer teachers need to remember that these kids need to see you as an authority figure, someone who cares about them, but also somebody who cares enough about them to lay down some regulations and boundaries so that they actually achieve. So start again, give them the expectations, and then start to manage it. The good news is that anybody can do this, and it just means that you have to rely on the structural mechanisms of the school, not so much on your amazing charisma or personality.
So go back to basics, start from the beginning.
Yeah, very back to basics, and you have to know what the basics are first of all, because a lot of new teachers don't know that either. So the person who wrote in there shouldn't beat themselves up. This is very, very common.
Fantastic. Another question here. How can I go about implementing a positive behaviour policy where I look to reward good behaviour rather than just focusing on the bad?
Right, two things.
This is a good one.
You've touched a nerve with me here. All behaviour policies, if they're good ones, are positive. I think the word positive is a bit of a weasel word here, because it seems to suggest that if you focus on poor behaviour, then that's not being positive. Getting kids behaving in a way that assists their learning is positive. What that means is we need to be adult enough to face up to kids who present challenging behaviour.
Yep.
Now, it's absolutely true, and I know that, for instance, people like Charlie Taylor say you should try and make sure you give 5 pieces of praise to one sanction, and there's maybe something in that. I mean, I think he's certainly on the right track, because praise should be a really important part of your in-class behaviour policy. But, and everything before the but is suspect, if you're not doing the sanctions and the consequences, and essentially, giving kids a bit of a tickle when they are not behaving properly, then the positive stuff will never work. You cannot just simply catch them being good all the time, because with some kids you will need the Hubble telescope to find these instances. and even if you can find them, it's not necessarily the best way to motivate children. It's a great way to motivate children into behaving, but it's not the only way. So I would say to that person, be positive by all means. Give them small pieces of meaningful praise that is proportionate to the act involved. Don't start gushing, and don't drown them in praise, because then it becomes something which nobody really cares about, because you just become the nice teacher who always praises. It's a bit like watching X Factor. The only person that anybody really cares about impressing is Simon Cowell, because he's a bit tough.
Yeah.
Nobody really cares about Talisa. Nobody cares about, what's the Irish one? The Irish one, Louis, because they are always quite nice to people. So the key thing here is be nice when it deserves being nice, but also make sure that when you need to call the kids out, they get called out on it every time.
Absolutely. This teacher wonders whether she really needs to shake things up to control behaviour in her year 9s, and she's wondering whether a new seating plan might work. Do you think seating plans are key?
Yeah, a seating plan is absolutely, I would say, essential in most classrooms. I'm always very cautious about giving universal rules which apply to every classroom in every instance. I think that everything that a teacher does is one amongst many strategies, and like any strategies are appropriate to the context in which they're applied. However, having said that, I think seating plans are an enormously effective way of helping a class behave. Many reasons. Number one is because it helps you to get to know their names for a start. But even more importantly than that, it's a very powerful and yet quite a tacit, quite a subtle way of establishing your authority in the classroom. You get to say to the kids that this is a learning space where hopefully you'll enjoy yourself, but this is a learning space. And you will be put in places and seatings and groupings which are appropriate to you learning, as opposed to you sitting where you fancy sitting. Because let's face it, the chances of a child sitting next to somebody with whom they work really well are fairly low. The chances of a child sitting next to somebody with whom they chat really well are enormously high. So they can't be allowed to make that decision. Later on up the school, if children get to a level of maturity where they can handle that, then by all means allow them to have say in where they sit and so on, as long as you're the final adjudicator. But a seating plan is, for almost everybody, a fantastic way of getting your class into shape. I would absolutely agree with that.
This teacher asks, what is an effective punishment for pupils misbehaving? My year 10 seem to think that being sent to the cooler is better than being in class, and keeping them in at break time usually just means they're even worse afterwards because they've not been able to let off steam.
Yeah.
So what to actually punish?
It's all about what's appropriate. I always say that, I mean, one of the things which I always come back to is that one of the quickest and easiest and simplest ways of applying a sanction or a consequence to a pupil to let them know when they've done something which isn't appropriate is a detention. Some people say, well, isn't that a very blunt instrument? Well, it very much depends on how you use it. If you set a 5-minute detention so you can have a chat with a child who's really struggling and wants to learn, then that's one thing. If you set a 30-minute detention with a pupil because they were cheeky to you, that's another thing. Whenever I sanction a pupil, again, proportionality is incredibly important here. If it's really, really bad, it goes up to an hour. If it's a really terribly bad thing, then you get parents in and you get heads of year involved and so on. But when they get a sanction, a large part of the purpose of a sanction is to deter, which means it has to be, and this is where people start to blanch slightly, it has to be a little bit unpleasant. Now, nothing which abuses their Geneva Convention guaranteed rights, but as long as it's something which makes them not want to return again, it's supposed to deter. Children aren't supposed to want to be in a sanctioned situation. So, for instance, I have absolutely no problems whatsoever about setting children copying work, or copying from the dictionary, or writing lines out, or heaven forbid, writing an apology letter, or even just writing a letter about what went wrong with their behaviour and what they could do better next time, because obviously apologies could be somewhat manufactured. It needs to be something that they wish they weren't doing. Sending a kid to the cooler, now clearly we're in Waterloo Road territory here, or some kind of internal exclusion room.
But they're very common though.
They are very common, I know, and they're very useful. Because it's very, very useful to have someone to take a pupil out of a class when they're misbehaving and disrupting the education of not just themselves but others. But many children engineer situations where they can be removed from classrooms because they don't like a teacher, they don't like a subject. And I would question what they're doing in the cooler. If they're just simply being held there, if it's just a holding pen, then quite frankly, it's not a very effective sanction. It's not going to be any kind of consequence which is going to deter them in future. It needs to be somewhere where they have to sit and they're monitored closely by people who either discuss with them what happened or ask them to do some work in the meantime. So, that's my feelings on coolers. What are they doing there? That's the first question I would ask.
How can I help my year 7s to understand or care that when they disrupt the class, they're impacting on everyone else's ability to learn? And I suppose the key question is, the key word there is care.
Yeah.
Do they care?
It depends. It depends on what kind of background they've come from. It depends on what kind of context, where their heads are. Emotional maturity differs enormously from child to child. This is an obvious thing. You see children at year 7 whom you would entrust with your wallet and your house keys, and there are some children
for dinner.
Yeah, well, let's not go there. And you get children with whom you would barely turn your back on.
Yeah.
So every child starts from a different place, and this is one of the key differentiation needs a teacher has to try and address.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to making kids care about the impact, that's a very hard one. I'll tell you why. Because we can't control their minds, much as we would wish,
Absolutely.
or not wish, as the case may be. All we can do is modify their behaviour and set a really good example for them, be a fantastic role model, and demonstrate the types of behaviours you would like to see from that pupil and from your class. The ideal is that as you chide them and praise them for a variety of behaviours, they will learn what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And you then attach, this is one of the most obvious things in the book, you then attach rewards to desirable behaviours and sanctions to undesirable behaviours, and hopefully in the child's head those two things get fused together, so they then start to associate poor behaviour with things they don't like, and good behaviour with things that they do like. That's why rewarding is in many ways as important.
What are your favourite rewards in terms of getting kids behaved? What do you use?
The cheapest one possible, because there's method in the madness there. It's not just because it's cheap, but also because it's much more effective, and that's just praise.
Right.
Genuine, sincere, absolutely targeted praise. Now that can happen in front of the class if it's one of those kids who loves public praise and attention. There are many kids who hate that.
Absolutely.
So what you need to do is perhaps write something in their book, a phone call home, a message to mum or dad or the guardian. One of the things that is often forgotten is that we often phone home when things go wrong.
Absolutely.
We rarely phone home when things go fantastically, or if things are just running smoothly. And I will always try and take time round about kind of after the first or second term to do 20 or 30 phone calls to parents or guardians of kids who are just doing great or doing okay or doing what I've asked them to do. It's just one way of driving that kind of thing home. But making them care, I'm not sure we can ever make them care.
Fantastic. I think this is one which will resonate with many people on our site. I'm about to do my first teaching placement, that horrible moment, and I'm absolutely terrified about how I'll manage the behaviour of my students, as it's a really rough comp that's somewhat notorious. Open-ended question. Any ideas?
So no, quite an easy one then, obviously. I would invite the person, if they're going on their first placement, to brace themselves for a tough time, but to try not to see it as, oh my God, I hope I survive this, but rather to see it as a training exercise, one in which they try and develop and demonstrate the skills and learn skills from other people, and one in which they try and make an impact on kids' lives. What they shouldn't be looking for is perfection in their first placement. That's not going to happen. Teachers, I think, are by their nature quite altruistic. We are a fairly nurturing bunch. That's why most of us are in the profession, because we really give a damn about kids. The dark side to that is that when things go badly, we punish ourselves and we beat ourselves up and we take it home and we weep tears of frustrated anguish. When they go to that school, they need to find out, okay, here's some basic stuff. Find out the school's behaviour policy. Observe some teachers who are good at running classes and really, really focus on what they're doing to get good behaviour. Now, I'm going to issue a caveat with this. It's sometimes not very useful to observe people who've been teaching for 10 years at that school, because all their behaviour management has been done in the past, and the kids now probably trust and respect them, right? What's really, really effective is if you can try and observe somebody who's been at the school for 1 or 2 years and is really good at behaviour management, because you'll see what they're doing out in the open. You'll see the guts of their lesson, as it were, exposed, like the Lloyd building, or kind of a car engine turned inside out. So watch that, get them to observe you and to give you not just teaching and learning feedback, but behavioural feedback. I think the behavioural feedback is something which nationally we still enormously neglect. as if great teaching and learning will get kids behaving. This is nonsense. It's one of the great myths of modern education. A well-planned lesson can still have terribly behaved children in it, no matter how well-planned your lesson is. If I walked into a brand new school in a really difficult, challenging class, I would still get an enormous level of challenge back. You know, I don't have any superpowers either. It's simply a case of building up trust and a relationship with the class, and them knowing that you're going to do exactly what you mean to do. So, watch great teachers, emulate them, find out what works for you, because every teacher has their own style, and then reflect upon that every day. But don't take the failures home with you. Just think to yourself, what can I do better next time? This is a training experience. Nobody expects you to have the children in the palm of your hand after 3 or 4 weeks. Okay, so it's kind of have high expectations of yourself, but not so high that you punish yourself.
Do you remember your first teaching placement?
Enormously. I wrote extensively about it in my second book. But
Which you can buy where?
Which you can buy at all good bookstores. But I returned to it often in my head because I had such a terrible experience in my first placement in a school which was a failing school, and they tend not to put new students into failing schools. And I made every mistake possible. And one of the biggest mistakes I made was not asking for help.
Of course.
And blaming myself far too much. So that's kind of where I come from on that one.
This is a very interesting question, and I'm sure there are plenty of NQTs out there who feel similarly.
Sure.
I look really young for my age, not me.
Yeah,
First asking
I get
the question.
that a lot. Yeah.
Both of us. I look
25.
I look really young for my age, and some of the older people tower over me, look older than me. I find them very intimidating, and both the girls and boys have taken to teasing me and pretending that I'm a pupil. Help!
Right, okay. I think, that's a very, very common one. Absolutely. Especially when somebody goes straight from school to university to teacher training to back into school again.
22.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a tough one. I think we often defeat ourselves inside ourselves before we even step into a classroom. Yeah. I have seen loads of terrific teachers, 21, 22, 23, who do really well with tough classes because they don't think of themselves as being 21, 22. They think of themselves as being the teacher. The adult and the grown-up. I mean, I know children at school, for instance, who already have got such an adult persona, perhaps possibly because they're primary carers for somebody else, and they understand what it means to be in charge of other people. If you haven't had that experience, if you haven't grown up with the experience of being in charge, and it doesn't come naturally to most people, and it didn't to me, and I used to run nightclubs for 10 years, you know, I'd had a lot of experience running people, but it's not the same thing. So you get into a classroom, and you think that you're young and you feel you're young, and that's going to come across in your teaching and your lessons. If somebody teases you about looking like a kid, you're going to have to decide for yourself, is that friendly? Because you do get nice kids sometimes saying, oh, you look very young. You know, and if that happened, quite frankly, I'd give them a merit these days. But if it's a child that doesn't know you and coming up and saying, oh, I thought you were a student, then that needs to be challenged. Now, it could be something as simple as a cold, hard stare and saying, well, I'm not, can I help you? You know, it's spoken in that tone of, I'm an adult, what do you want? Or you could even perhaps make it clear and say, yeah, I'd rather not make any personal comments. Let's not make comments about appearances, please, yeah? And then if they do it again, then you sanction them for it. Seriously, you draw that line in the sand and you say, I do not want this. Because one of the problems that I often find, particularly amongst newer female students, is that often, and I know it can work both ways, but just in my experience, I've heard a lot about this. Often, the older boys in school can subject them to a kind of a low-level sexual harassment.
Absolutely, yeah, we hear a lot about that.
Which is an enormous problem, and unfortunately, sometimes it's not particularly low-level either. And one of the first ways in which they kind of get into that type of behaviour is by undermining the teacher for their age, for instance, which then leads on to comments about appearance, which then leads on to comments about sexuality. So new teachers need to nip that in the bud and just, you know what, just park it. Try and put it from your head. You are not 22 years old. You are an adult. If you are fortunate enough to look 22 years old, then you may pat yourself on the back for that in your private life. But in the school, they need you to be a grown-up, so be the grown-up.
And they need you to be a grown-up.
Yeah, they need it. They might not think they do, but they absolutely do. Okay, so act like it as well.
This comes from the other end of the spectrum, and I think will also resonate. I feel embarrassed about asking this question, as I've been teaching for years, and I really feel like I should have control of my class by now. But things seem to be getting worse year on year. I've lost a lot of confidence and frankly don't know where to start with taking control of my class's behaviour. Can you offer any advice to an old-timer who's struggling?
Yeah, I know the feeling. This is, bizarrely enough, this is probably the third or fourth most common behaviour query I get on the forum. People who have been teaching for quite a while and feel like by now they should have it all down pat. I don't blame people who've been teaching for a long time who still struggle with behaviour. But because behaviour management is a constant challenge. Yeah. You could be fabulous at it and you'll always have to work at it whenever you get new kids or even your kids you've had for a long time. So they mustn't feel bad about it. And also, alluding back to something I said earlier on, the training for behaviour management is very, very patchy in this country, terribly patchy. Yeah. If you're lucky enough to be trained at the outset by a maestro of behaviour, you then, if you're lucky, might pick up those skills. Maybe your school's very, very good at coaching and supporting you in those types of skills. But many people don't have that experience. Many people go through 10, 15 years of a career, 20 years of a career, and nobody once says to them, here's how you could do it better. When I coach teachers, I walk into their classes and I watch them for the full lesson and I will give it as straight as I can. Here's what I think you could be doing better. Then I'll film them the next time so they can see themselves. Mm-hmm. That's a really powerful technique that some teachers can do. So if there's somebody else in your school whom you admire for good behaviour management, have the guts to say to them, I would like some help from you. Yeah. Off the record observation. It's a non-structural observation. It's not part of performance management or anything like that. It needs to be a supportive observation, which incidentally, observations should be in the first place. Yeah, but that's another matter. Watch yourself teach. Discuss it with somebody else who really knows their stuff and get some ideas from them. And start small. You cannot change your entire teaching attitude in one lesson. What you can do is start to work on perhaps the three most important things. Mm-hmm. It's normally rebooting your behaviour expectations, as I mentioned earlier on. Do the kids really know what you expect from them? Yeah. That's number one. Number two is, does anything happen to them when they don't comply with your expectations? Do they get a sanction? Do they get a detention? Or do you let it slide? Do you say the next person that talks is going to get half an hour detention or a phone call home, and then you don't do it because it's the end of the lesson and you're a bit tired? If you do that, then you may as well not have any boundaries. Yeah. Because you're demonstrating to the children that you don't. So there might be an enormous chasm between what you say are the class rules and what you demonstrate as the classroom rules. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of thing that older teachers are particularly prone to. Because once your ship starts going off by 1 degree, give it 20, 25 years, you're miles away from where you want to be. Okay, so that's the simplest advice I could give.
That was actually what I was going to follow up and ask. Are there lots of teachers who start off being quite high performing in terms of behaviour management and somehow it falls away?
Yeah, I think...
Why is that?
I certainly don't have any data to suggest that it's an enormous problem. All I know is from the people that I speak to and coach and train that it's a problem. Mm-hmm. And it happens because once you're in a classroom, you're kind of alone. Absolutely. You're alone with 25 people. Now you might have the same class for several years, or you might have 15 different classes every year. 2 or 3 times a year you might get observed for performance management, or Ofsted may darken your door. And in that circumstance, it will be a very, very artificial lesson. There'll be other adults in the room and so on. What I think many people in many schools are missing is a commitment to continuing professional development, which actually is a commitment to continuing professional development, and not simply trying to tick boxes from Ofsted. Important as they have to be, obviously, for the school, I often think they're not targeted at what the teachers really want to learn and get better at. I think line managers need to get back into a situation where they help their staff to identify genuine needs they have in their teaching, as opposed to slightly kind of artificial, heavily data-driven needs, which are sometimes useful, but sometimes not really the core of what's going on in the classroom. Mm-hmm. Teachers are the best people to judge and evaluate that. So one of the things I would say to teachers, and this applies to line managers, middle managers and senior managers, is everyone get back into each other's classrooms. Watch each other, but don't make it part of some kind of performance management cycle, because then people are terrified of making a mistake. This needs to be not a high stakes observation, a low stakes, high gain observation, where everyone's helping each other again. When teachers start doing that, we become enormously powerful, because the shared experience of any school is a wealth, and it's probably just waiting there buried to be uncovered. So that's what I would say to help that situation.
Fantastic. This teacher points out that she's had a really rough year with some terrible year 9s. First lesson back after half term, she's determined to reiterate her expectations. But she wants them to come up with these expectations themselves. She's worried about them thinking it will be funny, or they'll come up with something inappropriate. Any ideas on how to do this, or how to handle those students who don't take it seriously?
Yes, I have a very simple suggestion how to do this. Yes, don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't do it. I think it's a lovely idea getting children to come up with their own behaviour rules. The reason why people like doing that is because it's very student voicey, and the idea is that it kind of encourages students to buy into their own behaviour. That's a lovely idea. I mean, it really is, and there probably are some, there probably are some classes of perhaps the Swiss family Robinson can do this, or the Von Trapp family. Most classes I've encountered, most teachers I know whose classes they've encountered, have classes with a mixture of children, some of whom are incredibly mature and lovely, and will gladly come up with some fabulous rules. The problem with that kind of exercise is, what happens if the children come up with an idea with which you don't agree? If they come up and say, we should have 5 minutes break every 5 minutes. What happens if they say we should have mobile phone breaks after 15 minutes? That we should all be allowed to pick our seats. Now, obviously you're going to start saying, well, I'm sorry, that's not possible. At which point, the illusion that you've given them any kind of choice whatsoever shatters. Which means what you've been doing to the children is you've been lying to them. You've pretended they've got buy-in when they don't. The alternative, of course, is that you do allow them to come up with the classroom rules, which will be a disaster 99 times out of 10. If your class is misbehaving just now, you wait until you allow them to design the classroom rules. You wait. It makes you look like a mug. It makes the teacher look weak and disempowered. The children want you to be an adult. They want reasonable, fair, just rules in their classroom. The weird thing is that even really challenging kids prefer the lessons with the tough but caring teachers. They leave school and come back years later and saying, I preferred your lessons because I knew where I stood with you. They don't like to see adults unsure about what to say and do with children. They find that an odd situation because they acknowledge themselves as children. And if the adult starts acting like the child in the classroom, well then the power will just go to the children and they'll make things up for themselves. So my simplest bit of advice, and I don't mean this harshly because it's a lovely idea, and I think it's great that this teacher is reflecting upon their practice and wants to improve things. But what they need to do is to go into the classroom with their set of rules, and that will avoid them thinking it's funny because they won't be funny. Because guess what? The rules of a classroom are remarkably universal.
And not very funny.
They're not, not unless you really stretch it, not unless you're a very funny person. Don't speak over the teacher. Put the hand up if you want to talk, or indicate to the teacher if you want to talk. Nobody opens windows and doors without permission. Stuff like that, very, very basic things, which quite frankly aren't negotiable. If I want to keep them safe and learning, they need to know that there are some basic rules that every classroom is governed by, and all my kids know that.
It's pretty black and white.
Yes.
This poor teacher is afflicted by looking quite like Robbie Williams.
Nice. Is that an affliction? I don't know.
I don't know either.
Most people would love that.
The kids often call her
That is an affliction. Now I understand.
Hire Robbie, or their rendition of angels in a corridor.
Nice.
Other teachers could not stand to be addressed as anything else but sir or miss.
Yeah.
Should I continue laughing it off or treat it as a serious offence?
Yeah, this kind of ties in.
Have a laugh or not?
Yeah, this kind of ties into what we said a little bit earlier on about looking young. It's kind of similar. If you are a new teacher and kids are doing that to you, make no mistake about it, they are mugging you off.
Yeah.
They are mugging you off. They're not doing it as an affectionate tribute. No. They're not doing it as an homage to the master of manic depressive pop poetry. You know, they're taking the mickey.
Yes.
Now, that's not a good look for a teacher. Now, if you are charming and handsome enough to look like Robbie Williams, again, that is a reward in itself.
Indeed.
Everything else is all about being a teacher. Until you get to know them better, they don't make personal comments like that about you, so you have to address it. Now, I understand the laughing it off thing, though, because obviously one strategy would be to go ballistic every time it happened. That's exactly what the kids are looking for.
Yeah.
So that's something you don't want to do. You don't want to, race up to them and say, "How dare you? Don't you know who I am?" But what you have to let them know is that something gets done about it. The key thing to hear is knowing their names. So if it's a regular group of pupils, perhaps you don't teach them. What the person needs to do is get to know their names by asking perhaps another member of staff.
Very interesting.
And then making sure that perhaps you can go up to them and say, "Listen, guys, a joke's a joke, but I don't find it very funny, so could you not do that? I don't make personal comments about you."
Yep.
Right? Laughing it off only works up to a point. The problem is if you keep laughing, they will take it further because they think that you'll do nothing about it. So you then go up to them, tell them you don't find it particularly funny. If it happens again, boom, you do something about it. You speak to the head of year, you phone home, you pull them out for detention, whatever. You do something which shows them the consequences happen. And you don't do it alone. You get a form tutor or a head of year or a member of SLT or whomever to cooperate with you in this. Don't make it look like you're just doing it by yourself.
Absolutely. You mentioned the magic phrase SLT. We've just had this in on Twitter. This teacher says SLT denied that there is a behaviour problem. I've heard this before myself, actually. They've got a vague behaviour policy and it gets him or her down. Him or her feel pressured not to escalate punishments as a result of this vague behaviour policy, I think.
Yeah.
Help! What can I do?
Is there an exclamation mark there?
There is, yeah.
Then I will help. This is one of the biggest curses of behaviour management in the
I'm
UK.
sure it is, yeah.
When the school doesn't provide an appropriate structure for teachers to perform good behaviour management. There's this kind of eternal dichotomy that I've spoken to I've spoken to SLT conferences where SLT deny it's an SLT problem. They think it's a teacher problem, classroom problem. And I've spoken to many classroom teachers who think it's an SLT problem. Guess what? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. That teachers and SLT are all members of the same group, all members of the adult community in the school, and everyone's responsible for good behaviour management, which means that everyone has to do their part. If you do your part, you can then expect other people to do their part.
Yep.
So, for instance, if you're in a school where the middle leaders or the line managers above you are a little bit wishy-washy, well, then you have to be clear as something very clear as crystal. You have to be extremely clear, and you have to be very sharp with the kids and let them know exactly where you stand. You then have to escalate to middle leaders when you think it's appropriate. If you go up to them and they are very fuzzy and a bit cuddly, then you need to get them to clarify what they're going to do and when. If the school behaviour policy is fuzzy, that is not a good thing, because it's supposed to be a clear framework that everyone can look to and go, yes, I know what it means. It's okay for it to be ambiguous enough to allow individual interpretations in a classroom, but at the same time it has also to be clear enough that people can still hang something on it. However, the flip side of that is if the school behaviour policy is a little bit fuzzy, then you can clarify it for your middle leader. And this is the hard bit. This is when you have to manage upwards.
Absolutely.
You have to say to them what you're going to do and by when. And get them to nail their colours to the mast and say, I'm going to do this by then. And if the time comes and the deadline has whooshed past them, you then simply go back to them in an entirely professional manner and say, did that happen? Oh, it didn't. Can you tell me what is going to happen then? Because I need this sorted.
Oh, interesting.
And it's very difficult, but if you just stick to that kind of script, you're not challenging them or confronting them, but you are being assertive with them. You're requiring them to do their job. However, I will say this, there are some schools who appear to have behaviour policies so woolly and so soft, and some senior leaders, and I stress some senior leaders, who are so fuzzy about this that they don't deserve to have the responsibility of looking after pupils. And it makes me so angry when I see kids and teachers
being let down,
being abandoned in that situation. Yeah, absolutely. Because what senior leaders need to remember is that the school in which they operate in is very different from the school in which new staff operate in. It may as well be two different schools. You can walk around with perhaps 3 lessons a week all the authority in the world. You've been there for 10 years. The kids know who you are, and they know you've got power, and the kids will behave for you. And everywhere you go, children hush in awe.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an NQT or you're a supply teacher who exists in a particular hell of their own, and you go into a class and the kids don't know you and the kids think you might be gone in a week's time, you are in a different school. You've got 25 lessons a week or however many lessons a week. You don't have time to follow up on all of the misbehaviours and so on. That's a completely different scenario. SLT need to get into new teachers' classrooms more.
Full stop.
Full stop, yes. End of, as the kids say.
This teacher has asked via Twitter, I think this is an interesting one. It's sort of flip side, I suppose. How do I deal with children telling tales constantly?
Right, this is as old as the hills.
Great
I actually have a fantastic solution to this, which, funnily enough, somebody else told me when I was on the TES Behaviour Forum several years ago, so I hadn't experienced this myself. First of all, if children are routinely telling tales, it's normally because they want attention.
Mm-hmm.
And married into that is because they like to see you do something. They like to essentially see you being used as an extension of their power. You know, look what I can make happen. Look what I can get you in trouble. You know. Now, obviously, there's a massive danger, which is that sometimes children aren't telling tales; they're telling the truth. If somebody slapped, a kid around the face, you would probably want the kid to report that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you are reasonably sure that there is a situation whereby tales are being told. I love the phrase "telling tales."
That's
it's so
great,
archaic.
isn't it? It's really good.
What you can do is you can say to both children, "Oh, that's very serious, and this is very serious indeed. We must get to the bottom of this event." You then hold them both back after school and get them to write. I mean, obviously, as long as they're old enough to write, get them to write out their side of the story, and at least 10 minutes of that. And if they take 2 minutes and say, "I'm finished," you say, no, I think I need more detail. Right? And so they've got at least 10 minutes writing away. And you'll get 2 stories. Now, these kids, they are not Moriarty, the kingpin of crime. Most kids will slip up. So for a start, they don't like being kept behind.
No.
I know that there's a slight element of unfairness here because you may well be keeping in the odd child who isn't involved in the situation. But if you start sending this message out that people who tell tales will start getting 10 minutes of quality time writing their stories, they may not be quite so quick to do it. Additionally, as a teacher, as time goes by, you will start to get a sense of which kids are more prone to this type of behaviour. I know that doesn't sound like a kind of a Crown Court level of proof, but this isn't CSI. We're running a classroom, and a good teacher will start to get a gut reaction as to which child is a tale teller. Mm-hmm. In fact, sometimes even parents will say to you, my kid tells tales quite a bit. Be careful. It's uncommon, but it does happen. So use a conjunction of those 2 strategies.
Yeah.
But what you mustn't do is if they say such and such is hitting me, or such and such is annoying me or poking me or curse my mum, you mustn't just suddenly overreact in the spot because that's just what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. You have to say, right, that's very serious, take 2 names down, we'll deal with it after school. Get them to come back, get them to stay behind, get them to realise that telling some kind of tale is going to cost them. Now, if the tale is genuine,
they shouldn't mind.
They shouldn't mind.
Yeah.
They should actually be really happy that a teacher's interested enough. And conversely, if it isn't true, then they'll probably rue the day they picked on you. So that's I think that's a brilliant solution because it really does work.
Yeah, brilliant. I think we've got time for just a couple more. This teacher asks, a student in my tutor group has been behaving quite badly in class and started to bully his peers. I spoke to his parents about it just before half term as I thought it was important to nip it in the bud, but they just completely stood up for him. What should I do next? So I suppose there's 2 questions there actually. Is that what happens at the beginning of bullying?
Yeah.
And what to do about the parents who ignore your phone call home.
So these were supposed to be quick questions, right? How do you solve bullying and how do you establish relationships with parents?
How do you try and nip bullying off in the bud?
Right.
Spot it.
The problem with bullying is that it sometimes is, one fairly nasty character assaulting victims, and that's a very common experience of bullying. But often the whole bullying scenario is very complicated. What you might get is one child who's not liked very much by the class. Mm-hmm. The class then exhibits perhaps low-level bullying on that child. The child then retaliates by being extremely nasty. By that stage, the teacher gets involved and thinks the child himself is simply a bully. Bullying is normally a very complex web of social relationships, which isn't to say that sometimes you can't just pick a child out and say, yes, this is your fault, because I do. If a child does something which is cruel or nasty or victimizes another child, they need to be absolutely confronted on it. This isn't a time for poor you, let's have a cuddle. This is a time for, you must never ever do this. You must never hit a child. You must never talk about their dead parent or some horrible thing, which is where, that's where bullying goes. At the same time, you then need to say, right, is there a background to this, and discuss it with the class. I don't blame the parents for backing up the child, because they'll just get the child's point of view, which may well be true.
Sure.
So interview as many of the kids as possible. You should start getting a common story coming out, which you as an adult can then marry up with everyone else's stories and start to get perhaps a larger picture of the truth.
Yeah.
Bullying is a long and complex process. If you're a classroom teacher, oh no, they're a tutor, aren't they? If it's a tutor, then it is very much your duty to get involved and perhaps phone as many people as possible and speak to as many people as possible, with the head of year as well. But as a tutor, it really falls to you. Secondly, when it comes to the parents, understand that the parents, of course, are going to back their children. It's a very, very difficult thing to try and coax a parent into understanding their child might be bullying. The best way you can do that is by finding specific things that the child has done which are absolutely irrefutable. Mm-hmm. If you can say to a parent, your child said to child Y, you are an effing this, that and the other.
Yeah.
Most parents would go, yeah, that's pretty out of order. The parents still might then come up with, yeah, but they were provoked, but at least then the parent will realise that there's a texture to the situation, rather than just simply there are goodies and baddies. It's very rare you just get black hats and white hats in a classroom. There's usually something more going on in the background. I don't know if that answered the question.
I think that's perfect.
I think in the time I have, anyway.
This teacher is on Twitter asking, she's got a class of lovely Year 9s.
Oh, good.
Which is great.
Take a picture.
But they are very chatty.
Oh, dear.
This teacher has tried detentions, but it doesn't appear to be the solution. And not easy, to be fair to all of them. I presume it means group detentions.
Yeah.
Help again. Another help! Exclamation mark.
Well, in that case, to the rescue. It's funny you started off by saying they're a really good group, but they're very chatty.
Yeah.
That means they're not a very good group.
Yeah.
Because if they're chatting, they're not learning. Now, don't get me wrong. Every teacher needs to build in a little bit of chat time into their lessons, I think, to give the kids a chance to, to say that burning issue to their next door neighbour that they've wanted to say. I don't know how long this teacher's had this group, but if they've only had them since the start of this term, they might still be quite chatty. It's going to take time to get them to understand your rules. If you ease off on things like sanctions, detentions, and phone calls home now, then you are going to lose the opportunity to improve their behaviour. For some classes it takes 6 months, for some classes it takes a whole year to get them to understand. Eventually, all but the toughest of nuts...
And then you hand them over.
Yeah, exactly. Take them, they're yours. If you do that, you will wear them down. It's a process of attrition, but for their benefit. If they are chatting, that means you're spending time getting them quiet again, which means they're losing learning time, which means their education is being damaged. So it is a behaviour detrimental to their learning, which is when you have to step in. But keep at it would be my advice. These things take months and months and months to bed in, and it takes some kids a long time to realise that it's worth it in the long run to do as you say rather than to not do as you say.
I think that's quite a good way of finishing, actually.
Okay.
I think it's quite a neat summary.
Okay, fine.
So all that's left for me to do is to thank Tom very much for coming in.
My pleasure. It was an absolute treat.
My colleague Mike has also asked me to point out that Mr. Bennett here will be featuring at the London Festival of Education on the 17th of November
Guilty.
at the Institute of Education. It's going to be fabulous, I'm told to say. So you can get your tickets at www.londonfestivalofeducation.com. Please come. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.